Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this second edition of the Singapore SG webinar. I do hope everyone's keeping well, either working from home or from the office. All right, so basically just a couple of housekeeping rules before we start off the session. So should you have any questions or queries during this session, please feel free to use the chat function or even raise your hand during the session itself. Alternatively, there will be a session whereby there will be a Q&A at the end, whereby Marcus will be able to get onto those queries by him. So today, we'll be looking at athlete monitoring and the basics of injury profiling, risk profiling. We will walk through the fundamentals of injury risk profiling and potentially debunking the myths of injury predictions. I'd like to introduce my co-host for this session, James Grigson. James, say hi to everyone.
G'day all, good to see you.
Yeah, and joining us today as our guest speaker is our very own senior sports scientist, Marcus Colby. He has a PhD in injury risk and prevention and been with the company for nearly 5 years now. He brings with him wealth of experience working with many high-performance organizations in various roles and departments, and primarily working very closely with the NBA, NFL, NHL, AFL, and even the likes of the Australian and US military, amongst others. All right, without rambling too much, I'll let Marcus share more on his end. Take it away, Marcus.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you everyone for joining us. Like Dan mentioned, my name's Marcus Colby. I've had the pleasure of working for Fusion Sport for close to about 5 years now. As Dan mentioned, my background and PhD was around this theme of injury risk and profiling. I even had the joys of going down the rabbit hole of trying to predict injuries at one point in time, and a lot of learnings from that experience. In terms of the clientele that I've had the pleasure of working with, that's been pretty broad over the last 5 years. So I initially started working in that military environment in Australia with our special forces. Had the pleasure of being embedded within the West Coast Eagles Australian football team for close to 6 years. Which is a really good learning experience on the ground. And more recently, the last 2 to 3 years, working across the NBA with a number of teams in the league itself, a number of college environments over here as well, dealing with lots of different sports, lots of different opinions in terms of how we can approach injury risk and how we can mitigate it with certain strategies. So really looking forward to sharing some of those learnings today, and hopefully as a collective growing this knowledge base and furthering the field as we go. So to kind of kick things off and talk to, I guess, this concept of injury risk profiling, I've read some really good books and heard some really intelligent people kind of question the need to do risk profiling, and always asking why are we looking to do this? Why are we trying to implement such system and process? And I've got a really good quote here, and thankfully we get to work a bit with the Lakers, and they won the national championship last year. And one quote from the man himself, LeBron James, was, "The best thing I can do for my team is be available." So we're working as practitioners, as performance coaches, to maximize availability across our clientele, and that's ranging from sporting to military groups being ready to deploy at any point in time, and give them the best development opportunities for that individual or for that team to achieve their goals. So that's the simplicity of it. We are looking to implement these systems to maximize that availability. So just to make kind of sense of injury prevention as a whole, and this is for sports, for the clinical setting, for the military, there's some really kind of, I guess, basic frameworks for how we look at preventing injuries. And this is really important when we start to conceptualize and think about our philosophy in this space of building systems and processes to prevent injury. And so it's broken down in a really good kind of article that I'll encourage you to read, and we'll leave some links in the future documentation of this, is this sports-related workload and injury risk. So simply not knowing the risks will prevent injuries. You need to have a system and a process behind how you approach this in your respective industry. So the factors that we can kind of think of, and if we break down injury prevention, we can think of universal factors. So that can be as simple as protective equipment, let's say the boots I'm wearing as an operator, the equipment I wear when I'm taking the field in any given sport. That can also be things on the nutrition side of things. It's applicable across every environment. Am I properly fueled? Am I rehydrating properly? As well as mental health as well, the psyche of an injury, and even returning from injury when we think of recurrences and how we can best prepare our athletes and operators. So we need to think of it firstly from a universal perspective. As we start to get into our respective industry or sport or military space, we can think of selective risk factors. So certain sports are going to be contact versus non-contact versus the chaotic military environment. So we need to be aware of the factors relevant to that selective environment. We need to think of the differences in males and females in terms of the demands there and certain hormonal cycles that we may go through. And we need to think of the age and training age within that environment as well. We know there's sports you can play for a very long period of time. Let's take golf as a good example. And there's other sports where, unfortunately, you start to break down, or your fast twitch fibers don't work quite as well as they used to. So when we're designing these systems and these processes around preventing injury, we need to be aware of those specific factors. And finally, I guess in terms of the specific prevention strategies you can put in place, we want to look at kind of indicated or targeted factors that are associated with that sport. So that can be, in this scenario, identifying high-risk athletes and then applying subsequent strategies. So that could be load management. Are we periodizing our program, or are we aware of the loads that are put on our respective operators or athletes, and do we have strategies or processes around how we I guess roll those out in our environment. So just a quick introduction there. I think this is really important to highlight in terms of the basics of injury risk profiling and the basics of prevention as a whole, ensuring that you have gone through this process of identifying the big tickets, the big rocks of town, and then getting into some of the smaller strategies that you can kind of implement throughout. So I guess we're all aware of those universal and selective factors generally in our environments. It's always good to sense check and review. So I want to go into some of these more kind of targeted examples or evidence-based principles that I think is a really good kind of starting point for what we could factor into a risk profile. How I've broken it down, you'll see in the left-hand column, we've got a table here of the evidence-based principles that we have established in both a military and sports setting, and then some examples of what a risk profile metric could look like. So just to kind of fuel some thoughts around how we could analyze or apply these principles and ensure that we are kind of sticking to our plan in that respect. So to discuss these in a bit more detail, so the first principle, looking at establishing a moderate chronic load, so that's that extended load period, say over 4, 8 weeks, 6 months. How can we define that we are accurately kind of sustaining loads within that kind of space? And so an example here, let's say from a military perspective, we could be looking at 15 to 20 kilometers of on legs volume. So that could be running, that could be simple activity per week. So that can be an initial kind of metric that we're looking to hit on a weekly basis. This next principle, looking at minimizing the week-to-week change. So I'm sure those that have dug into the research in this respect have seen that if we can keep that week-to-week change, depending again on the phase of season or the phase of training, whether they're getting ready to deploy, whether they're in pre-season, there'll be times when this will come out of that 20% range. But if we can minimize that and keep it within, say, 20% week to week, then we're probably looking to best kind of minimize any of those higher risk scenarios. Ensuring a minimum training load is maintained. I think I'm guilty of this one occasionally when I drop off. If I let my volumes drop off to a certain extent and I ramp up, and one week I do nothing and the next week I do a lot more. I've got a sore foot right now, I'll tell you that. So yeah, keeping a floor of at least 10 Ks volume per week is an example of how you can kind of work within your demands for your respective environment and set those targets and challenge your group to meet that minimum training load. Avoiding inconsistent boom-bust workload patterns. So a really interesting metric that's come out and been utilised in the human performance space in probably the last 5 or 6 years, and has been scrutinised as well. And I'm very happy to discuss that with anyone that wants to discuss, is the acute to chronic workload ratio. But as a general guideline, seeing a ratio between 0.8 and 1.5 for any given session is an indication that you are relatively consistent with your training. So like I said, a lot of very smart people out there with lots of mathematical backgrounds challenging this approach, but from a general consensus, it will tell you whether you've been relatively consistent. The other metric that I really like to utilize with my clientele, and a lot of them do use, that we brought up before, is that Z-score approach. So that's looking at the average load of an individual and seeing if there's a significant deviation from what they typically elicit in any given session. So having a range between -1 to say 1 standard deviation is a relatively good guideline for say maintaining a relatively stable load. This next one here, just to give you some more fuel for thought, is regular high intensity exposure. We're all aware of that. And I guess in terms of what's available in a team sport setting, looking at that high speed run, that high speed intensity, which I haven't listed here, is a really good metric. But from just our other industries and what we've seen here is certain exposures within that higher heart rate zone. So a really good internal load metric is heart rate, and if we can look at regular high intensity exposure in these higher zones, that's going to ensure that our operators, our athletes are prepared for the demands of their respective environment. Another one there from a subjective standpoint, more just seeing if the cohort you're working with are responding to the training as you see fit, would be something like an RPE, or rated perceived exertion, that they can fill out via their mobile, is greater than 7, at least having 1 hit up per week where you are challenging your group to ensure they get that high intensity work. And then lastly here, before I kind of move on in terms of these principles, is building a load foundation. We've kind of mentioned a few previous principles there, but this is more on an extended basis. So when we're thinking about our preparation phase from a military perspective, our pre-season phase from a sport perspective, is your cohort that you're working with, or your individual athletes or operators, completing that prescribed work? And if they're not, that's something that does have a latent effect throughout the season, and I guess in terms of their ability to perform and perform the loads that you want them to at any given point in time. So an example there would be, say, hitting 80% of their prescribed work and ensuring that they are, say, close to those required volumes for their respective competition. So I guess just to change tracks slightly here, I just want to kind of share some insights in terms of my tips, I guess, when developing your injury risk profile. I think that's a really important term I want to specify here. Is this is going to be different for every sport and every environment. One, it's going to rely big on your coaches and how they respond to the information you're providing them. And then I guess in terms of your demands as well. So one thing I would focus on initially is a specific type of injury that you're trying to prevent to an extent. So I think when we say we want to prevent all injuries, I think that's great. I think that's a great overarching goal. But when we get into building something to inform us of higher risk scenarios for that injury, we want to get a bit more targeted in that respect. So from a sporting or say a common injury perspective, soft tissue injuries is quite common. So what can we identify in your respective environment to focus this profiling on? And then identifying metrics that would relate to that specific kind of injury focus. From a, I guess, data feedback standpoint, using traffic light systems throughout, somewhat of a warning index of kind of Robertson and colleagues did a nice paper in 2016 on using warning indexes to kind of use something that we're all familiar with, the traffic light. So something I would really encourage in terms of how you present this information to your colleagues, to your athletes, if applicable, and to your coaching staff. So I think from the evidence-based principles we just spoke about there, it's good to be aware of these different metrics and how you can look at things. But ultimately, this comes down to working with humans, and we're extremely complex people. So it's important to have all this information in the bank, but ultimately you need to work with your athletes, your operators, your humans, and understand how they're feeling within the program. So that conversation at any point in time with your collective performance staff is one of the most critical pieces in this being properly kind of utilized. Context-specific actions as well. Within building these profiles over and over again with a number of clients, it's important to be aware of the rest of the program, even though you've kind of focused in on XYZ variable to inform you of say this high risk scenario, is a term I like to fall back on. You need to be aware of the context of things. So if it's pre-season, for example, if it's a preparation phase, we're going to see increases in loads. We're going to see load spikes, and people are going to be sore because they're responding to that stimulus. So really important that you're aware of what phase you're in and what environment, and you can act accordingly with your coaching and performance staff. Finally here, documenting your decisions. So I think something in terms of being a good learner with this process and building your own philosophy on how to tackle this in your own respective area is documenting what you do when you, let's say I see an operator or an athlete flag, and I have this conversation all the time with clients is how can we actually, I guess, do retrospectives on what we did, how we intervened, because that's going to be really crucial information when that scenario comes up again. So documenting that in some respect is a really useful tool, and you can learn a lot from that over the years. So I guess, the final point here that I kind of reiterated before is how are we actually going to get the coaches to absorb this information, whether that's coaches, whether that's leadership from a military standpoint. We need to ensure that when we're designing this, when we're thinking about the ways we communicate this information, that it's ultimately going to assist the performance coach and the program. And finally, I guess the epicenter of it all is the athlete or the operator. We need to put them first in the way that we're translating this information and ensuring that it's going to improve them, not hinder their ability to perform. And as I mentioned just down the bottom there, how does the coach communicate and digest this information? We're all different learners in different ways. We can have people that are visual learners and graphs and traffic light systems are the best. We can have other people that prefer to see just a simple table, highest to lowest in terms of who is the highest risk on any given point in time. So what I'll show you quickly here, I really like this excerpt from a TV series or a documentary called All or Nothing. This is actually the first season when it came out with the Cardinals. So just a quick example of some of the challenges in different professional environments and what you have to be aware of coming back to you. So I'll just put this one on.
How intense are you in the last 2 periods of practice today? Normal. Come back to intensity down a little bit. Also, the loads are getting higher at the beginning.
So a perfect example of what we all face in some respects. You go to your coach with all the information in the world in terms of what you think will inform on the program, and you get responses like that where we're not going to back down our loads. Sometimes when it's time to go, it's time to go. So a really good example there. And that's, yeah, again, to reiterate that point, is how do we best communicate that information to coaches? Are we speaking the right terminology? Are they truly understanding of what this data actually measures, and how we can really kind of influence the program? So a nice little snippet I like to show occasionally. So I guess just some fuel for thought. So these are some of my biases over the years in terms of how I structure various kind of risk profiles. So an example here that I've kind of set for a military environment. This is some demo data from our demo site, essentially, through the SmarterBase platform. So what we've got here, I guess, just in this first column, I obviously want to be aware, regardless of the flags that have come through on any given day, whether that person is available to train. So they might be unavailable because they're not on site for any given reason, or unavailable from a medical standpoint. So that can be defined from any angle, I guess. And then I've got a breakdown of some of my kind of key indicators from a external load perspective. So just overall volume from the program. So that can be external load from a GPS or a watch, or the number of laps on a pool, or just a wearable that a military operator has. So the volume that's been prescribed. And this is the acute to chronic workload ratio. We've turned this into we've taken it out of the ratio format and kind of displayed as a percentage. So 1 would be the equivalent of 100. And what we can see here is everyone's kind of sitting within that range of 82 to 150 or 0.8 to 1.5. So my first indicator of kind of load. Then I'm looking again at kind of the subjective side of things. So I know I can prescribe volume, and I know that's what will potentially be needed in that environment. But I want to see from a well-being standpoint, how are they trending? Are they trending up compared to what they normally are? So I've just got a plus minus here, or are they trending down in terms of what they typically report? So Riley, for example, in this this daily report is trending significantly lower than what they typically report in their well-being. So maybe they're feeling a little bit off, and I need to have a conversation there. I've got the sauna status here as well. I always like to go in on kind of one metric that, really defines readiness in some respect. And if someone's really sore, I want to know on the front foot to be proactive with my prescriptions today, or ensuring that that person can do some additional warming up or whatever is required to get them ready to go. And finally, from a recovery standpoint, I think this is something we underestimate when we're thinking about risk, and I guess our process is what are they actually getting from a recovery bank standpoint? The volume that we're prescribing, is that if we see an increase in volume, are we seeing that increase in sleep we might need based off the program there? So another factor that I'm keeping an eye on in this example. And then finally, from a cumulative standpoint, I want to know who I need to talk to first at any point in time of that day. So if I wake up this morning, I have my group of operators or athletes fill out their subjective questions. If they have a wearable of some point, at some form, I get the sleep information here, and then I can see the volume data, say as of the end of day yesterday. And I know from this dashboard here, I need to facilitate a conversation with William. So really kind of focusing on who do I need to have a discussion with, either with my performance staff or with the athlete themselves, to ensure that I can get them on track for a day of quality training, or a day of competition in whatever environment that looks like. Okay, so we thought we'd stir the pot up a little bit and talk to some of the state of predicting an injury. So to date, we've kind of spoken about risk profiling, some of the fundamentals of injury prevention, and understanding some of the basics you can implement from that respect. And now we want to get into, I guess, an area I'm absolutely fascinated about, I'll tell you that, but trying to predict an injury. So this is an excerpt, this list of items here that we're going to discuss quickly is from Sam Robinson, someone I really admire in this field. We have the pleasure of working with across a couple of different domains, and he did a really nice Twitter feed kind of explaining some of the downfalls of the state of injury prediction. This is food for thought, stuff to kind of have a think about when you're I guess, trying to go down these avenues. And yeah, some really good discussion points. So I think we've all been in scenarios when we think they're high risk potentially. Let's say it's pre-season and you've got to get the volume in if this fringe level player is ever going to be a chance. So that's where we see scenarios where, okay, the model might say we could predict an injury on this given day, but we let them train for the contextual factors around the model. And that comes a human ethical thing, which I'm sure we've all, in some performance settings, when we're working with the highest level athletes, have kind of questioned in some respects. So these true positives is the term from a modeling standpoint, and we let them go essentially. The opposite to that is removing someone when we don't need to. So let's say we've got a bunch of flags for a given player from that say dashboard we saw before, and they're our highest performer in that environment. They might be our squadron leader, they might be our platoon leader on a mission that we're about to go on, or they might be our top 3 athlete, whatever that may be. So we have scenarios where we cotton wool them and we try just bring them in, and that can again affect the model. And we're human and we're not processing like a computer does, so we have to face these scenarios. So from a numbers standpoint, we don't really have enough injuries. Even if we were to pool all the injuries that have occurred in elite sport for the respective environments, we really don't probably have enough injuries to statistically do something as meaningful as we'd hope. So it will predict some certain scenarios just because the sample size is not there. I guess in terms of implementation, I don't know if anyone's ever been in the scenario of sitting on the side of a training session, watching someone run around and then they go down with an injury. And you think at that point in time, do we have the tools there to actually stop that injury? Is that something that's happened acutely in that window between the start of training and the point of injury in the session? And it's just, we don't have the systems or processes yet to run these in kind of real time. I think we're seeing some really good strides in terms of live monitoring systems, which is really exciting. But even within that moment, we're not really measuring the stresses of the knee angle and the takeoff or whatever that may be at any point in time. The next one here, and something I kind of struggled with initially when I was trying to code all my data for my PhD, is we don't really just interpret it the same as what a computer does. Risk isn't, or predicting an injury to us is just a yes, no, an injury occurs. It's quite a binary decision. But in the real state of things, we're still looking at a range of probabilities. So there might be X number of risk, or there might be, which could be very low, 2%, or there could be a 90% risk. And it's not really a binary decision whether we go or stop. The tech probably isn't sensitive enough just yet as well to give us a really good model in that respect. So you always hear about bad data going in, you're going to get bad outputs coming out. So just another point to be aware of. I think in terms of the data, we've spoken to that. We're still not quite sure why some injuries occur as well. I think we probably have an understanding from a physiology and a biomechanics standpoint why certain tissues do break down, but at some, and I'm sure we've seen this as well, some injuries you followed the program to a T, and maybe it's genetics, maybe it's something else that we're not aware of just yet, and that injury still occurs. These next 2 points in terms of the approach we take. So the models that we've previously used, and I've used some of these models in the past as well, have been pretty linear in their approach. So we need more advanced business analytics kind of approaches to some of these questions. When we do that, we get machine learning tools that give us this black box approach. We're not quite sure how we got to the output, but we do get often some better kind of accuracies in that respect. And then finally, we probably don't have enough data to kind of generalize our relationships from sport to sport. I've read lots of literature reviews around this space, and I'd like to say that one football code relates to another, but the movement demands are very kind of specific to that respective code. Or can we take everything we've learned from sport and apply to military? We need to be sure that we're looking at maybe more universal or selective factors in that respect, and not getting down to too much of the sport specific kind of factors when we're trying to say go down this path of predicting an injury. So again, some food for thought, and shout out to Sam Robinson for a really good kind of write out for those trying to understand this, and you can feed him, you can follow him there as well if you're interested in this space. All right, so in terms of I always like to have a slide kind of towards the end of a presentation in terms of, say, Monday morning value, as I like to call it, wake up on a Monday morning. A couple of tips to take away with you. So from my perspective, and again, this is my bias in my learnings, setting up these rule-based systems. So the example we saw before, I know that I want to have relatively consistent loads. I know sleep is one of the best recovery modalities to prevent future injury and ensure the body is healing. Setting up these rule-based systems so you can flag as proactively as you can and identifying high-risk scenarios, not necessarily identifying when an injury is going to occur, but where are the scenarios that I need to be, say, hyper-aware of, is probably the best thing to implement as a first stage. These systems also develop over time. I've worked with numerous groups that we start with one version, we learn, we work with coaches, we work with even the athletes in some respect, and learn how they're responding, and then we tweak these systems, and it's an evolving process that you can work on. I guess this evidence-based practice, so the knowledge that we've kind of learnt and shared here, that is definitely important. This provides us with a framework and a philosophy to start with, but people working on the ground, that practice-based evidence, so what you actually learn while you're out there, when you're talking to the athletes, that information in this stage and the way we communicate is some of the most critical pieces of information when you're trying to put this together and knowing how your athletes and operators respond. When you design these reports, ensure that you're talking to your coaches throughout the whole process. If you're trying to develop this a system to build your rules out and identify the high-risk scenarios, ensure you're communicating the whole time, so you're not just throwing metrics in there that the coach isn't going to understand, or if you are trying to put something in there that's relatively new, ensure it's in a format that they can digest. You saw the example before where we took soreness and made a status, for example. It was stable, improved, decline. That's in a much friendlier way to digest, and it still gets my point across rather than just a number. And lastly, as we spoke to, those context-specific actions. Be aware of everything else that's going on around, say, your bias and philosophy for these profiling or systems you put in place, and act accordingly based on the context, based on the environment. If it's game 7 of the NBA finals, like, you're playing. Like, if it's the grand final, you're going to have to play in a sporting sense. And then in that military sense, when it's time to go, it's time to go. You have to be ready at all times, and you need to have context around the ways you implement these systems. All right. Dan, did we have any questions in the thread that we want to discuss?
Yeah, I might jump in, Marcus. Thank you very much for going through all that, mate. In lieu of time, so what I want to do is, we've got time for one question from the audience. So please, as I'm finishing up here, type in your questions or raise your hand. You're happy to jump in and speak to Marcus. We might do 2 questions, so I might ask one, and then we'll see if one from the audience can jump up. Marcus, I guess you spoke to 2 contexts there. You spoke to the sporting world, which you know and have experienced, quite extensively. You also referenced the military environment, which you did have an opportunity to work in, both here in Australia and over in the US, where you are at the moment. It's quite often that you see athletes rested for loading or injury risk reasons, right? In those sort of low risk scenarios, and you're protecting someone and things of that nature, as you're alluding to. In the military environment, how have you seen that sort of practice implemented in a military setting? Is it something that is, to the extent of, I can imagine to the extent of, okay, well, somebody, in a training period, someone needs to take a break, but have you seen it implemented to the extent of someone might miss a mission or miss an operation or miss something more significant, to the tune of the sporting example where they may miss a week because of loading considerations or niggles or things like that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And yeah, I've been fortunate to work with a number of special operations groups, I guess, in Australia and here in the US as well. So I think culturally the shift at the moment is coming from, you need to train all the time and be ready at all times, to be a little bit more structured and a little bit more planned in terms of how we approach our various cycles before deployment. There are going to be scenarios where you do need to deploy at a moment's notice. But I think we're seeing a lot more kind of shifts in terms of, okay, what does that lead up look like? And then after, say, a deployment, what does that recovery period look like? And are we monitoring that from both a physical and a psychological standpoint, that they are getting back to their normal, and ensuring that they are back on track? So whether they're using the term rest, I guess, is probably not a common term in the military environment, but probably training smarter in terms of the type of sessions they're doing, and utilizing more technologies and tools now to better inform. And in a military environment as well, there is a lot of onus on the individual to look after their body, to train, to ensure that they're prepared at a moment's notice. And we're seeing various technologies kind of help facilitate that and automate some of that feedback.
Thank you, mate.
Cool. Great. So yeah, thank you, Marcus, and everyone for attending this webinar. So in lieu of really the time, so there you have it. Really, I trust everyone has had an insightful session for everyone. So if you have any further burning questions, please feel free to email it to us. You can email it to myself at daniel.chan@fusionsport.com. And thereafter, we may relay it to Marcus to potentially just answer to your queries as well. All right, so meanwhile, our webinar is scheduled once a month. So should you have any topics that you'd like for us to kind of talk about, do send it through as well. We'll be most happy to just work it out on our end as well. If not, stay tuned for further details for the next webinar, and see you guys soon. All right. Cheers, guys.
Perfect. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys.